You may ask yourself, why do we talk about Cossacks so much on this show? Well, because it's part of our military culture, Cossack spirit, Cossack symbols, and values like freedom, bravery, and independence. It's about telling empires to go to hell. That's kind of our thing. All the symbols, the flags, the sabers, the songs, all that is our Ukrainian values. That's our heritage. That is something in Ukrainian blood that gives us our Ukrainian identity. But the second reason we're talking about Cossacks is that in terms of hybrid warfare, the culture is also a weapon. At some point, Russians looked at Ukrainian Cossack heritage and they were like, hey, we like the idea, we'll take it too, just like they always do. So they kind of invented their own version and called them Kazaki, basically the same name, but absolutely different vibe, because instead of warriors, you get a gang of alcoholics in furry hats, armed with whips, medals, and a heavy hangover. Previously, we've talked about Russian descent, the airborne dudes who punch each other in fountains and think that's a tactical training. We've also mentioned Russian Spetsnaz, elite Russian units that somehow lose to Ukrainian conscripts and elevators. Now it's time to dissect Kazaki, the notorious Russian Wish.com version of history, and talk about who the hell they are and where did they come from, and how exactly did Kremlin use Kazaki to invade Ukraine. Let's get into it. So how did Kazaki end up on Russian territory? Well, the short version is empire does what empire always does, steals stuff, moves people around like IKEA furniture, and then lies about it in history books. Let's start with Kuban region, which to you probably sounds Russian, right? No, my friends, historically it was mostly populated by ethnic Ukrainians. After the Russian Empire destroyed the Zaporizhian siege in the 18th century, which by the way is a nice way of saying stabbed Ukraine in the back after pretending to be friends, they took the survived Cossacks and said, congratulations, you're moving. Hope you like swamps and vodka. So basically they dumped them in Kuban and said, enjoy your new identity. Over time, these Ukrainian Kazakhs were sort of rebranded, like Twitter. Over time, they got their language erased, history rewritten, and culture completely repurposed for Russian propaganda. Fast forward to Putin's times, now the Kazaki are a loyal Russian paramilitary cosplay group. Their job is to beat up Russian protesters, protect Lenin statues, and show up at parades decorated with fake medals, like a Christmas tree in a Russian mental institution. Today, they pretend that these dudes are the heirs of Ukrainian Cossack glory. They help Russian cops beat up Azerbaijani nationals, arrest teenagers for holding blank signs, attack kids because they don't wear proper clothes, and basically do all the things that can only exist in a fascist state like Russia. So the bottom line is the Russian Kazaki came from actual Ukrainian Cossacks after centuries of imperial gaslighting, forced Russification, and a lot of really bad balalaika music. It's not heritage, my friends, it's a historical taxidermy, and they stuffed it really bad. So 2014, while the world was still blinking in confusion, trying to figure out if Putin was serious about invading Ukraine or just experiencing some kind of post-imperial midlife crisis, the Russian invaders moved in. Not with tanks at first, because that would have been too obvious, but instead they sent in the little green man in brand new uniforms with no insignia and very clear instructions: take Crimea, don't admit anything, and smile for the cameras. But hidden in that polite invasion package, like a rotten onion wrapped in fresh plastic, were another group, the so-called Russian Cossacks. They came from the Russian Federation to Crimea and Donbass. Of course, some of them were true fanatics, the kind that thinks that Mother Russia includes everything from Warsaw way to Alaska. Others were just guys with beer guts, no jobs, and strong desire to wear a uniform after reading Alexander Dugin. In any case, they were exactly what Moscow needed: disposable, deniable, and dumb enough to be thrown against a foreign country like Ukraine. Alexander Dugin, by the way, is the same ideologist of Russian imperialism, so much admired by Tucker Carlson, Steven Seagal, and other Russian assets from the United States. So what did Cossacks do in Ukraine? They mostly did the primitive job, of course. They established checkpoints, they patrolled streets, looted the houses, and basically were turned into a local law enforcement / military. In Donbass, for example, Cossacks declared themselves warlords. They established terrorist groups that were called battalions, basically founded and backed by Kremlin. Some of them kidnapped and tortured and ransomed civilians because technically people of Donbass were not Russian, they were Ukrainians. So Russian Cossacks could do anything they wanted to local Ukrainian population in Donbass and face no responsibility. Cossacks ran so-called protection rackets. Some just got lost and ended up on Russian television bragging about their heroism, which usually involves stealing a microwave, looting Ukrainian villagers, or shooting at road signs. Basically, same stuff you have witnessed 1,000 times since 2022. The fact is, they were not liberators. They were not even real soldiers. They were the theatrical extras in Russia's hybrid war, basically common Ruski cannon fodder, only in fur hats. And yet for Moscow they were absolutely perfect, because when one of those Cossacks beat someone to death at a checkpoint, or accidentally filmed themselves committing a war crime, a rape for example, the Kremlin could just shrug and say, well, that's not our guy, probably just a volunteer, like a local patriot of Donbass. The kind of local patriot who speaks only Russian language, arrived last week from Rostov, and gets confused by Ukrainian road signs. As you probably understand at this point, another reason Cossacks were perfect for Russia was to disguise the hybrid invasion of Ukraine as a civil war, where both descendants of Cossacks were fighting each other with just a tiny nuance. One of the fighting parties had never lived in Ukraine before and literally had Russian IDs. By the way, did I mention what the Russian Cossacks were doing in Ukraine before the Russian invasion? Because you gotta love it. So for many years, especially in eastern and southern Ukraine, the Russian Cossacks played the role of defenders of the Russian Orthodox Church, specifically the Moscow Patriarchate. You would see them standing outside churches, basically like bouncers at a nightclub, but they weren't peaceful worshippers. In Ukraine for decades, they were known for raiding and occupying territory. They were known for establishing Russian church on the captured land, often somewhere in the downtown where the land costs a lot, usually, and Ukrainian police literally could not do anything because in Ukraine the state could not interfere with the church, unlike in Russia where the church is directly supervised by the state. And knowing that the Russian FSB used Russian church to establish its network in Ukraine through capturing territory and also by capturing Ukrainian churches. In numerous incidents across regions like Rivne, Volyn, and even Kiev suburbs, Cossacks and other Russian-affiliated activists used force and intimidation either to capture Ukrainian churches or to prevent the communities from transferring to the Ukrainian church. There were scuffles, there were beatings, sometimes even armed standoffs, all to protect the Kremlin's spiritual franchise in Ukraine. Once again, Russian nationals with Russian IDs calling themselves Kazaki would come to Ukraine from the Russian Federation and serve as a brute force for the Russian Church, otherwise known as the embassy of FSB in Ukraine. After Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukrainian law enforcement uncovered an overwhelming number of Russian FSB and GRU agents acting as Russian priests. The maps, the weapons, the leaflets justifying the Russian invasion, all found in the Russian church buildings in Ukraine. And the Russian Cossacks were directly involved in guarding those Russian churches and storehouses, smuggling Russian propagandist leaflets and weapons, and acting as a muscle for the Russian priests. Basically, this is one of the reasons why you can often hear Putin calling Ukrainians and Russians the same people, because he wants the invasion of Ukraine to look like a civil war, because let's be honest, do people in France or Spain or the US even care about the difference between the Cossacks and Cossacks? Same stuff, right? Slavs are all the same. And this is the reason you are watching this video right now, my friends, because there is a difference, and our own ignorance is a weapon used against us in the hybrid war. My dear friends, please let me know your thoughts in the comments, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe, because if you don't, there's a real chance you will soon see some version of Russian Kazaki on your streets, and unfortunately, I'm not even joking. My name is Operator Starsky. Thanks for watching.